Okay. So hi everyone, welcome to UiPath Studio session 2, in which we will be discussing some of the fundamentals of UiPath Studio. So this would be the agenda for today. We would be discussing about variables, data types, different type of workflow layouts that are available in UiPath, what are arguments, control flows, and then we would also see some of this in practical implementation. And you'll go away with few of the exercises to have a hands-on practice that would give you a better understanding about whatever we discussed today. So first and foremost, what are variables? So variables are containers that can hold multiple data entry of the same type. So it's like if you want to store anything, you would use variable to store that. And it could be anything. You can store number in variable, you can store string in the variable, you can store Boolean in the variables. And not just that, if you have collection of the data, that also can be stored in a variable. So for example, email address can be a variable that can hold this value RPA developer@uipath.com. Similarly, you can create a name variable which would store your name, or you can create a date of birth variable that would be used to store your date of birth. Now, why are variables important? So it actually helps us to pass data from one activity to another. So when you are actually building a flow and you want to store some of the values so that you can later use it. So suppose you're on step 1 and you have extracted the customer ID, or you have extracted your phone number, or you have extracted the email address. And later in the program, you want to utilize that. So you would store that particular data that you have extracted in the variable, and wherever you want in the process, you can utilize that. So it's like a safe storage of your value in a variable. Advancing with any automation process would be hardly impossible without using variables. And this variable concept, it's not just specific to UiPath, it is actually universal to all programming language that you may have heard of, or you would hear about it in future. So everywhere, wherever you want to store data, you would use variables of a specific type to hold your values so that later on you can utilize it. Moving further. Now, there are 3 ways to create the variables in UiPath Studio. We will see what are those 3 ways. First is from the variables pane. So you would have seen how a studio looks like in the first session. And we would also see all of this in practical implementation, that how we would create variables. So at the bottom, you would see variables pane. So while clicking on the variable pane, a pop-up sort of window would come on your screen, using which you can create your variables. All you'll have to do, you'll have to just create new, click on create new, and give a name to your variable. And it is always recommended that you give a meaningful name to your variables. So suppose if your variable is holding email address, give the name email address to it. If your variable is holding employee ID, then it is advisable that you give a meaningful name to it, so that from the name itself, we can guess that what value that particular variable is holding. So instead of giving ABC, XYZ, or any random name to the variable, try giving meaningful name to it. So when you open the variable pane, you can simply click on create new and pass a name to your variable. Then go on selecting the data type if you want to change it. By default, if you go to variables pane and create a variable, it would be of string type. And we would be discussing about what are these data types, what are string, what are integer further in the session. Then the other way how we can do it is from the designers panel. So variable can also be created from expression directly in an activity. So there's a shortcut. If you do not want to navigate to the variables pane, there's a shortcut on how you can create variable. Whether you are in any activity, or you are in the properties pane, or you're creating any expression, wherever you press Control K, automatically set var colon would be written, which means now whatever name you pass it would be the variable's name, and it would automatically get created in the variables pane below. The other way is that you can also create it from the properties panel. The shortcut still remains the same. Even if you want to go to the properties panel and create it, you can go to any property, give Control K over there, and automatically set var would come on screen. And as you pass a name to your variable, that variable would automatically be created in the variables pane. So these are the 3 ways how you can create variables in your studio. And we would be seeing all these 3 ways in the practical. Next up, we have how are variables configured. Now, there are certain properties of the variable which actually defines them. Now, what are those properties? We would discuss them one by one. The first being name. So the variable's name is kind of a unique identifier. So like suppose your name is a unique identifier, you are called out by that name. So whenever someone takes your name, you know that they're calling you. Similar thing goes with variable as well. If you define unique names, like you've given name and you've assigned your name to it, then you have email address, then you have phone number. Every variable name is unique and they're holding certain value. So whenever you're calling that particular variable, whatever value they're holding, they would return you or they would display that value. Now, as I told you that you should be giving meaningful name to your variable. So try to give meaningful name to the variable as well as try to follow a naming convention while you're naming your variable. Pascal case is recommended. So you can go with Pascal case or Camel case. Now, what are these cases? That while you're writing your variable, so instead of writing entire email address in small, if you keep initial of every word in caps, so that's the Pascal case, which means you also follow certain uniformity while naming your variables. So you're naming all your variables following a certain defined naming convention. So these all are the best practices. It's not that if you do not follow them, you would get any error. Everything would still work fine, but it is recommended so that whatever you're creating it with a value to it. Next up, we have type. Now the type defines what kind of data your variable is holding. Now, when you're trying to store your name or when you're trying to store your email address, all these are basically characters or a bunch of characters. So that defines that your particular variable that you've created is holding string. Now, if you're storing your salary or if you're storing your employee ID or your own customer ID, so then you're storing integer or I would say numbers. So it defines that the particular variable is holding number. And in UiPath, the type is declared when the variable is created. So there are actually 4 columns when you open the variables pane. The first column being name, the second column being type, which tells you what type of value your variable is holding. The third being default value. Now, whenever you create any variable, if you do not provide it any value, there would be a default value assigned to it. So if you do not provide your variable any value all throughout the program, the variable would still hold a default value. Okay, so for string, it would be probably null, empty string, nothing would be assigned. Similarly, for Boolean, it would be false. Now comes the scope. Now the part of the workflow in which the variable can be used. Now your flow may contain of different sections. Now you have to define where your variable can be accessed. Okay. So suppose if you tell that, okay, my name variable should not be accessed in any other workflow other than this. So you can decrease its scope. So once you go out of that scope, your variable will not be accessible there. So that is how you define the scope. You can make it global, which means it is available and accessible everywhere all throughout the program, or you can restrict it by making it local. Then we have some common facts about variable in UiPath Studio. The type of value that a variable holds is determined by the data type of the variable. So as I told you, if you have maintained the type as string, which means we know that whatever value it is containing is mainly a bunch of characters or is a string. Now, based on data type, some variable can hold a single value while some other can hold multiple values. Now, these are different data types. For string and integer, you can only make your variable store single value. Say, example, if you have created name, you're going to assign your name. So I would assign Anmol Yadav to it. Similarly, if I'm creating an age, so I would assign my age to it, which would be a number or an integer variable. But if I want to let my variable hold bunch of values, not a single value, but multiple values. Say I want my variable to hold my hobbies. Now that can be multiple. So in that case, I can go with an array or I can go with a list. So that holds actually the collection. In Studio, variables are configured through their properties using the properties panel. So using the properties panel, you can actually change the property of the variable. Now the value of the variable can change through external input. data manipulation, or passing from one activity to another. So if you have provided any value to your variable, or even if you have not provided, it would still hold some default value. And how you can change its value? So either you provided some other input. So suppose you've created a name variable and you have not assigned anything to it. Now you go and assign your name to that particular variable. So that is one way. The other way is data manipulation. You have assigned your age to the variable, and then later on you added 5 years to your age. So that is you're manipulating the data and the value is getting changed. Say if now the variable holds 10 and you have done plus 5 years, so the value then becomes 15. So you have done data manipulation, and because of that, the value that the variable was holding has changed. Or passing from one activity to another. So you're doing something here, you're calculating say sum of the numbers, and then you're passing it to some other workflow who is again changing its value. So that is how the value of the variables can be changed. Then we would discuss about data types. So we would have heard about it, and we just discussed in the previous slides about string, integer, array, list. All these are nothing but data types. So we will see what are data types. So with some exceptions, the data types in UiPath are borrowed from VB.NET. So that's basically a programming language. And majority of the data types that UiPath uses follow the same thing that the VB.NET uses. So this is what a variable pane looks like. You have your name, you have your variable type, which is the data type. You have scope and you have default value. Okay. And if you just click on this variable type, you will see a drop down that has major data types listed here, but you can also go on browse for types and you will see n number of data types available. So we have Boolean, we have integer, int32 is integer, string, object, then this is data table, and this is arrays. So UiPath also has a proprietary variable type called generic value. So this is not something that has been borrowed from VB.NET. That is proprietary to UiPath, which is generic value. And the generic value can store any kind of data. So that's a USP of this particular data type. It can also hold data, including text, numbers, dates, and arrays. So instead of having different data types hold different values, generic value can hold everything. Now, some common data types are string. So if you want to store any text, you can use string data type. All you have to do is you have to pass your data in double quotes. Even if you want to store numbers, if you pass even those numbers in double quote, it would be treated as string. Now in numeric, we have these three types. Int32, which is integer, which is signed integer. So 10, 299, -100, all these would be integers. Then we have long, which is basically long integer. The range is more. So you can store something like this or these values. Then we have double. It also allows floating points or decimal points up to 15 to 16 digits of precision. Then we have Boolean. It stores either true or false. Then we have data table. So you would have seen table, which has rows and columns. The similar concept is data table. If you want to store a large piece of information in the form of rows and columns, like a structured data, then you can go with data table. Then we have date time. So if you want to store the current date or 7 days from now, or last year's date, or even the timestamp, what is the current time, or what would be the time after 1 hour. So all these things can be stored in a data type called date time. So this DDYY, is month, DD is day, YY is year, and then hours, month, and minutes and seconds. So this is how a date time looks like. It has the date as well as the entire timestamp with hours, minutes, and seconds. Then comes here the generic data type that can hold any type of data. So the generic value data type is particular and proprietary to UiPath and can store any kind of data, including text, numbers, dates, and arrays. UiPath Studio has an automatic conversion mechanism of generic value variables and arguments, which you can guide towards the desired outcome. Now we'll see what is this automatic conversion that we were talking about. You can see an example over here. Now what would happen here? If we are doing 1, 2, 3, which is an integer value, and we are combining this with a string value, which is 123. The output is 246. But if we do the same thing again, and now we are just converting it. First, we have written string and then we have written integer. Then the output is 123 and 123. Now I'll explain you why is it so. Now how generic value or this automatic conversion behaves is when the first one is 123, which is an integer. And with integer, we are trying to combine anything else, be it a string only. So because the first data type is integer, the other is also treated as integer. And that is why 123 plus 123, it has calculated the sum as 246. Now, when the first string is string, which is 123 is not a number, but it is being treated as a string. So then the second one is also treated as a string, though it is an integer. So when you combine 123 plus 123, this is also treated as string. So it would be combined and returned like a text. Similarly, if instead of 123, we had 2, and we are trying to combine 2 with 4, the answer would be 6 only, because if first item is integer, the other is also treated as integer. And if the first one is string, the other one is also treated as string. So this is the automatic conversion that we were talking about. Then what are the use of generic data type? So we'll discuss some of the business scenarios. Now, suppose data is extracted from a UI field and forwarded to another workflow without processing. So then you can use generic data type because you're not very much aware of what the data is or what type of data it is holding. So you can simply take out the data in a generic value and pass it to another workflow. Two versions of the same Excel file are being compared column by column. And the columns are different in terms of data type. The only relevant thing is which entries have changed. Now, when you're not sure, if you're comparing two columns and their data types are not same, so you can consider it to be generic, which means any general data type. And then you can go on comparing to see where is the anomaly lying or where are the changes being done. So that's the use of generic data type. Now we'll discuss few of the workflows. So there are different type of workflows that UiPath offers, and let's see what are those. So first of all, what is a workflow? So a workflow represents a small piece of automation that you can take and reuse in your project. So any small piece of code that you have written, that is nothing but a workflow. And it is basically your canvas, the place where you design your work. So using all the activities, all the properties, the variables and all, a small thing or a small piece of code that you have created is your workflow. And it defines the flow, how your work is going or whatever process you want to do. If you've designed it step by step, that is workflow. Why are workflows important? They are the fastest, most reliable and useful way of automating a process is to break it into smaller bits. So when you have to do something complex, if you break it into smaller chunks and then connect all the dots together, it would have been much easier other than writing the entire thing into one. So that is why workflows are important. And when you have created small chunks, you can also test those small chunks independently. So that if there is any piece or if there's any error in one of the pieces, you can actually identify it that, okay, the error lies here. And now instead of going through the entire thing again, I only have to work on this small piece. So most of the automation project requires the use of multiple workflows that can come together to provide you your solution. Now, these are the 4 different type of workflow layouts that UiPath has. First being sequence. So if there's any linear process that you have to do, you have 10 steps and you have to perform all those steps one after the other in a sequential manner. Then you'll go with sequences. Flowchart, unlike sequences, it has multiple branching statements. So if your process involves a lot of branching, like there are a lot of decision making, that if today's Monday, do this, then if it is Monday and if it is 10 a.m. in the morning, then do this. If it is Sunday, then do this. So if there are a lot of decision making statements or decision logics, then you can go with a flowchart. So if you have such complex business process that has a lot of decision to be made, you can go with flowcharts. Then we have state machines. So if based on certain condition, you have to transit or jump from one state to another, then you can go with state machines. And then we have global exception handler. So that's basically to secure your program and provide it a error handling mechanism. So global exception handler comes like an additional thing with your workflow if you choose it. So if there's any error within your workflow anywhere, if you have 10 workflows and in any of the workflows at any position, if there's any error, the control will directly come to global exception handler, and you can use global exception handler to take your next steps. Like you want to retry, you want to ignore the error, or you want to stop your process. So global exception handler, which means globally all across your workflows, if there's any exception, it would handle it, and so the name. Now we move towards UiPath Studio to see all of these in practical implementation. Now over here, you can see that we have Studio. So over here, you can click on variables. First of all, we'll have to select an activity to set variable scope. So for that, you can drag a sequence here. Now, once you have dragged the sequence here, either you can go here and create a variable. So all I have to do is I have to click on this, give a name to my variable. So I'm going to give it name, or I can give it email address. Now my variable type would be string, and I can also set the scope. But as of now, because I only have one sequence, it is only showing in scope sequence. Now, either I can give a default value here, or what I can do, I can drag an assign statement. And this is how I can assign a value to my variable. So I can give email address. As soon as I type E, it would automatically show all the variables that I have like this. And then I can go and type here abc@gmail.com, something like this. Now, the other ways I told you of creating the variable is that if I drag an assign activity here, now how I created this particular variable is that I went to variables pane. The other way is that over here only if I press Control K, you can see set var is written here. Now, if I create any variable here, I just pass in a name. Okay, say I pass employee ID and I'll press enter. Now, if you open the variables pane, you can see employee ID is already created here. So you can either give a default value here, or you can also assign some value here. Also, you can also create values from here as well. So this is the properties pane. So from properties pane also you can create variable. The shortcut remains same. You can do Control K and you will get set var. Now, whatever variable you create here would again be created in the variables pane. So that is the three ways of how you can create variable. Now, once we have created the variable, say suppose I'll also assign some value to it. Now I say that my employee ID has to be an integer and it doesn't have to be a string. So now we will see how do we change the data type. So under variable type, you can see once you click on it, you'll see a drop down here. So these are few of the basic data types being listed here. I can change from string to integer. Similarly, if I go to browse for types, a pop-up would come like this and you can see n number of data types here. So according to whatever your requirement is, you can go and choose one of the data type. So suppose if I go on with an integer value, so now I have to give it an integer value. So say, suppose I give my employee ID as 1024, something like this. And here is my employee ID. I can also go and print my email address and employee ID by using write line. So if I drag my write line here and I say, okay, print my email address. So once I run this thing, I can see my email address written here in the outputs pane. So we will run it and see as well. Now, I was even talking about scope. Now, if I also have one more sequence here, right? And inside this particular sequence, if I go and create a variable, so I'll drag an assign activity again, and I'll do Control K to create the variable. Okay, so suppose I create hobbies. And as of now, I'll assign swimming to it. Now, if you open this particular variables pane, you can see hobbies is being created. Now, to avoid confusion, let us also rename the sequence. So we will name this thing inner sequence, and we will name these sequences outer sequence. So if both of them would have the same name, you might get confused. So I've changed the name for, the demo purpose. Now, if I select my inner sequence, you can see I have created a hobbies variable. Now, if you go in the variables pane, you can see the scope. Hobbies has scope as inner sequence, while the remaining two scope is outer sequence. Now, this hobbies variable will not be accessible outside this. You cannot access hobbies variable here or here. Whereas because this has the outermost scope, you can access these variables inside this. And if you want hobbies also to be accessible outside, you can go and change its scope from inner sequence to outer sequence. Then you can access these hobbies everywhere. So this is what a scope is. Now, if you actually go and run this thing, you can see email address would get written here. Okay, so we would run it. And over here, it would write line the email address. So it says RPA Summer School execution started. That's my process name. And if you see abc@gmail.com, we see here, right? So using write line, if you want to print anything, you can print it under the output pane. Now, the different type of workflows that we discussed about, under home tab or under design tab, if you click on this new, you'll see we have sequence, we have flowchart, we have state machines, and we have global exception handler. So sequence is this only. You can also drag sequence and flowchart from here as well, from the activities pane. So if you have to perform any sequential set of activities one after the other, you can go with the sequence. Or if you have decision-making statements, then you can go with a flowchart. So I can click on a flowchart, I can give it a name and then click on create. Once I do that, my flowchart would be created and I can use it. So my flowchart would look like this. I have a start node. Now what I can do, I can assign an age to a variable. Okay, so let me do this thing. I'll do Control K and I'll do age. And I'll assign a value to it. Say suppose I've assigned 40. Now, since my age is an integer variable, 40 is an integer thing, I have to make sure that I'm passing an integer variable here. So I've changed my data type to int32. Now I will check that whether my age is greater than 18 or not to see that whether I'm eligible to vote or not. So because I have to make a decision, so I can go with a flow decision over here. So that's an activity you can search for, flow decision. So if I drag this particular activity here, now it also shows us an error and says flowchart does not have a start node. So it's very necessary that you tell your flowchart that from where my flowchart actually starts, what is the first step. So for that, you can do whatever is your first activity in your flowchart. You can select that activity, right click on it and do this thing, set as start node. As soon as you do that, an arrow would start from here and point to this. Now you have to tell your flowchart, after this, what is the next activity that you have to perform? So we have to take a flow decision. So what you'll do, you'll take out an arrow and point it to this. Now this arrow is pointing here. So it knows that after this assign statement, this has to be executed. Now in the condition, I will write that if age is greater than equal to 18, now this will return me a Boolean variable, which is true or false. You can see it here, it's written Boolean, which means as an output, I will get either true or false. Now to display on the screen, I can have a message box here. So if it is true, I'll print something. And if it is false, then I'll print something. So if it is true, I'll print that, okay, you are eligible to vote. So I'll open this text editor and I'll write, you are eligible to vote. And I'll copy this thing to paste it in the false message box also. So I'll select the message box, go to properties pane. From the properties pane, I'll select this property text, open it, paste the thing here, and just add you're not eligible to vote and click on OK. Now, once the flow decision has been taken that whether age is greater than equal to 18 or not, I'll also have to tell a branch that, okay, if it is true, go here. Okay, so I'll drag this thing here and bring it here. And if it is false, then go here. So drag this thing and bring it here like this. Just a second. Like this. Now, if I run this particular thing, now because I've passed already a value to age that is 40, so I'll run this thing and then we'll see. Probably it should come as that you are eligible to vote because this thing would become true. So I should get a pop-up on my screen saying you are eligible to vote. Now, if I do the opposite, that I pass an age that is not greater than equal to 18, so let me pass 16. And if I run this thing again, now this thing would become false. The flow decision that we take, age is greater than equal to 18. So 16 is not greater than equal to 18. So it would come as you are not eligible to vote. So this is all about variables, data types, and different type of flowchart in UiPath Studio. Now I'll pass it over to Daniela and she'll walk you through the remaining agenda. Over to you, Daniela.
Thank you. I will share my screen and we will continue with the next topic, which would be arguments. Okay. So to align with everything, sorry.
Didn't we break for the quiz before arguments?
No, it should be next after arguments.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So to align on everything that that Anmol has explained to us, we also need to use arguments, which is a separate type of, let's say it's kind of like a variable, but in this case, in real automations, we need to use it to pass within workflows. So what Anmol created was one workflow, which was the main, for example, and then a separate one, which is the flowchart. Now, if you need to combine the two of them and pass information between them, this is where you use the arguments. So for real automation scenarios, the code standard is to divide the project into multiple workflows. And for this, we need to pass the data. What do we use? We use arguments, which have a separate property than variables, which would be the direction. We need to indicate within the workflows if you need the information from another workflow, or if you want to pass it through from this workflow to another. So you have three types of direction, which would be an input. It means that it's coming from a different workflow, an output if you want to pass it along to another workflow. And then also you have in-out. In-out means that this information comes from another side, but within the scope of your workflow, you will want to change the data that is stored in there and also utilize it somewhere else. So what is an argument? The arguments are very similar to variables. They store the data dynamically. They have the same data types. So every data type that you can use in a variable, it can also be held in an argument. And they support every method and property as well. The difference is that they pass, as we said, the information within the workflows. And they have the additional property, which is the direction. These directions are very important also as well to highlight it in the naming convention that you are using. So they have a separate naming convention from the variables because in them we need to indicate the direction as well. So when we create arguments, we have separate workflows. So the idea would be if we connect workflow number 1 with workflow number 2, we will see that we will need to use the activity in workflow within our workflow, I know, and then pass the information between them using variables. We will see this later in the practice round. So if you want to pass information from workflow 1 to workflow 2, then you would have an input argument from the workflow in the workflow 2, but you also need to have an output argument on workflow 1. And they, in between, they connect within with variables. So how can you create arguments? So similar to variables, you also have 3 different types of creating a variable. So you have creating it from expressions. So the short key for doing this is different from the variables. For variables, you use Control K, but for arguments, you use 2 different ones. So if you want to create an input argument, you would use Control M. So it will create it directly as an input argument. But if you want to create an output argument, then you should do Control Shift M. This is only from the expressions editor. Now, if you also want to use it from the properties panel of within any activity, then you should right click and create argument or create output argument. So when you right click, it shows you a list, and then you can create both of them. The Control M and Control Shift M also works from any properties panel, because the properties panels are actually also expression editors. Now, from the arguments panel, which is to the right of the variables, you can also create them in the same way that you create the variables, but you should always be very careful of selecting the direction that you want the argument to be in. As we mentioned before, so the naming conventions of the arguments should also be in Pascal case, but the idea is that they always have the prefix of the argument direction. So in this case, you can use in underscore and then Pascal case of the name of the argument. So it should also be describing what the argument would contain. So for example, in underscore name or in underscore email address. And the same thing would be for out. You would say out underscore and then the name. And if you have an input output, then you should have IO underscore and then the argument name. So before this, maybe let me show you a little bit of how to create arguments. So to actually use arguments, you need to have separate workflows within your project folder. So in this project folder that I created, I only have the main. But if I wanted to connect 2 different ones by using the arguments, I would create a workflow. So in this case, I will create a sequence. And you can see in the project folder, it also appears as a separate workflow right here. And you can see that the arguments panel is here. You can create the argument by just entering here the name and direction following the naming conventions. And then you have direction and argument type. For the argument type, you have the same data types that you would have for a variable, and you can also browse for any type. Another way that you can do this is by having an activity. So if you, for example, just have here an assign, and you know that you want to create here an argument, you would do Control M, and then it will show you how to set the argument. So in email address, for example, I would say out. No. If you go then to the arguments panel, then you will see that that has been created. And the same would be for an output. If I can do it from the activity itself, or I can do it from the properties panel. So I can do Control Shift M, and then I will have the output. and then the argument has been created. Now, how would we use this? So I will set up here just a simple example on how you can see that the information is passed. I will use a log message to see what the email address and what the content of this argument is. And I don't have anything set up here as a default value. So in the end, you will see it once we run the process. I will here also create or assign a value to the output so we can see it from where we actually invoke the workflow. So since I have outscore created as an output argument, which was a string, I have here an error message that you can easily go here and adjust your argument type. Now I have my workflow created, but it needs to be invoked from somewhere. So in here in the main, I have two ways of invoking a workflow. You can either search for the activity, invoke workflow, and then pass it here. But then this activity is, you need to fill it in and you need to fill in the workflow file name. So I suggest always going to the project panel and then selecting the workflow that you want to use. And then you can just drag and drop and will automatically select the workflow file, and also will change the activity name to know which workflow you are selecting. If you see here, we have an orange. It means that you have some arguments that you need to import, and you need to also set a value for them. Now, I have these three arguments. I have two, which are input, and I have another one, which is the output. I can either here put some hard-coded values, like if I want to set the name, be my name, and here I can put my email address, for example. Or I can also just create a variable within my main workflow, which would be my email address. And here for the output arguments, as I need to collect the information, I will always need to have a variable to save the information that it's coming from the other workflow. So I can create here another variable, which would be the score, but I need to make sure that this variable that I have matches the data type of the argument. So I will go here and set, oh, it already did it. Then for the email address, what I will do is also here, just assign the value that I wanted to have, which is email address, and the information that I had here entered as a string before. Now, if I run this, what happens is this information about my email address will be the input of this workflow, and it will travel to the sequence, and it will log out my message. And then in the end, it will also assign a value to the output. And what I want to do here is to also log the output information that the other workflow created. Oops. So if I run this, which if I run the main, I will execute also the sequence, or I can just click on run, which run always runs the main. And once this is completed, you can also see the output, and you will see this is the email address, the log message that was inside the sequence, and then the 20 that was here outside. So now we can go to the quiz.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Daniela and Anmol. So I think we are all ready for quiz. I'll quickly share my screen. I hope I'm audible.
So
Yes,
for everyone,
yeah.
if you can join with the code, this would be the code for the quiz.
Yeah. Please join the one second. Hope you can see my screen. The code is mentioned on top. You can just go to menti.com and add that code. We have 37 people. I'll just wait for a few more seconds for everyone to join. 43, 44. So I hope everyone is familiar with the tool and with this process. So the questions will pop up, and the right answer obviously gives you points. But the faster you answer, you will get more points. So please make sure that you are on your toes and answer as quickly as possible for maximum chance to win the award. So we have 61. I'll just wait for 5 more seconds in case anyone else is joining. Anyone struggling to join, please post it on chat so that we know the status. Okay, I think we are good to go. And here we begin. Okay. So the question is, what is the shortcut key used to create variables? The options are Windows key, Control K, car key, and escape. Last 8 seconds. What is the shortest key used to create variables? I think all of you have already answered the question. Let's see where everyone stands. Wow, everyone got it right. That's quite cool. We'll just quickly go to the leaderboard. Who answered the fastest? Puneet and Maria, you are in the lead, but as we can see, everyone else is also quite close. So we'll quickly go to the next question. There are 3 more chances to get the results in your favor. Here is the second question. Again, please make sure that you answer faster. What is used to pass data between UiPath workflows? And the options are variable, parameter, argument, and postman. I think we have 3 more people to answer to. Yep. Last 5 seconds in case anyone is yet to answer. Okay, I think we have recorded all the answers. Argument is the right answer. Again, most of you have gotten that right. We'll see where we stand on the leaderboard. Well done, Harshit. Okay, so now the tables are turned. Daniel is now leading. Auber and Maria and Harshit, everyone is quite close. So we'll pause the quiz over here. We'll have a couple more chances to get the real winners. So we can continue the session, and towards the end we'll have next 2 questions where we'll be deciding the winners and gearing up for the prizes. So over to you, Anmol and Daniela.
Thank you. Okay, so next topic that we're going to discuss would be control flow. You can see my screen, right? No.
Yep.
So what is a control flow? So the control flow is the order in which the activities should be executed in a software project. So it's the detailed steps of what needs your automation to do. And for the statements that we mostly use in our code to indicate any logical things that we need to do, it's the control flow statements that are highlighted here on the slides. So as in any other programming language, we use conditions like if to have different results depending on the status of a variable. But we also use loops as well to either wait for something to appear on the page, for example, or to execute counters or execute something multiple times. But as well, we can use for each if we have a collection. So if, for example, we are processing an Excel and we want to go through each line separately, we would use a for each row. But if we want to go through a list of items or an array of integers, then we would use the for each activity. For this, we also have other types, which would be the switch, also very common in programming languages where you have different cases. And for each case, you would need to perform, let's say, a different action. And another one that we have is the parallel, where we would do actions that we want to perform at the same time. So what is the importance of the control flows? So the control flows take care of the order of which the actions are performed. So we need to make sure that we are making them clear and step by step. So we need to be organized in the way that we code as well. Activities like if, else, or else if, and for each enable us to define the rules and to automate the conditional statements that we would like to have within our project. And the loops will enable us to run a part of the automation a specific number of times, either until a condition is met or in a particular number of times. For example, if we already know the length of a collection. Or it could be indefinitely as well, but infinite loops are not a good thing in coding. So the three types of the control statements. So we have, as we said, the conditional. We have different activities on which we can use this within UiPath, which would be the if, else if, and switch. So these activities are actually built mainly to work within a sequence workflow. But as Anmol showed you, we also have two different activities that apply to the flowchart. And for an if condition, you can use the flow decision. But for a switch, you also have a flow switch. And why do we have the different ones? The idea is that for the workflow, you can use the branches in the code, and it actually looks a bit better than, for example, using nested ifs within the code. So the loops that we use would be while. You can use also a do while, or you can use for each. And then we have the parallel activity, which is the one that executes any child activities that you place on the scope, and it will do them in parallel. So for the first one, the conditional statement, which is if, it only contains one condition and then two sets of instructions. So if the condition is met, then we go to the block of then. But if the condition is not met, then we go to else. This is where you can see the example of the activity and how it looks in UiPath. the condition here always needs to be a Boolean. So the results of the condition should be a Boolean. And then anything that you place inside the then or else would be executed depending on if it's true or false. Then you have a separate control statement, which is else if. This is mainly if you have many conditions to check, but it's also avoiding having nested ifs because it always adds up in the code. Then if the first condition is met, then you perform the action under it. If not, then you can add a second condition that would be, then you have another then or else, depending on what's the outcome of this. So as an exercise, I'm going to show you how to do a simple if condition. So I'm going to go through UiPath, and I will create a separate workflow that I will call if exercise. And what we want to do here is to demonstrate the use of the if by building a workflow that tells the user whether they passed an exam or not. So what I would do is I will make it a bit more variable so we can also enter any type of data. So I will use the activity input dialog. With the input dialog, what it would happen is that it will show a message box where you have to enter data, and that data that you enter will be saved into a variable that we can later on get into the condition. I will say the title of the box that I want to show, and then the input label is the question that you are or the action that you're asking the person to do. So please input your name. And in here is where we actually have to enter the variable where we're going to save the content of what you're answering. So name, I will put here, and I will create a separate input dialog because I also want to have the score. So exercise again, and please input your score. And I will create another variable. As you see, I have this scope, and I have the two created right here. I'm creating them as a string, but I will then later, after you input your name and you input the test score, we will do the condition. So if your test score is greater or equal to 60, then you have passed the exam. But if you have lower than that, then you haven't. So when we place the if condition in Studio, it always shows you only the then, but you can just click here so you can see both options, then and else. Now on my condition, I have set the input dialog, the test score, to be an input string, but we can manipulate the variables as well to do conditions within the BV expression. So if I know the test score is actually a number, I can place here a function to convert my variable. And then I will just see if it's greater or equal than 60. If, for example, I would just place here the test score variable, then I will have an error because my variable cannot be, I cannot compare a string with a number. Okay. Then what we would do here is I'm just going to place a message box as well to present to you the message whether you have passed the exam. And for the condition, which is else, sorry, you have not passed. So when I execute this particular workflow, I'm not going to execute anything else from the other exercises that we did, but I'm going to just run the file, which is if exercise. And then I should be presented with two message boxes that I might need to drag around my screens. So this is the first one where I'm inputting my name. I'm actually not doing anything with my name, but we should have. I will say this is my name. And the other message box is please your score. So I'm going to say I was 80. And then you can see the message box, which is congrats, you have passed the exam. So in the same way that I just put here just a message, I could have also included my name. So congrats, and then the variable. And you will see then my name as well in here. Wait, sorry. So if I go through it again, my name is, and I was 20. And then it says sorry, and then the content of my variable plus the message that I also had there. So to continue now with the other conditional statements, the switch is also something that it's very helpful in automations because it executes a set of activities based on the value of a specific expression or a variable. So this is very useful when we need to have at least 3 potential sources of action. If you have 2, then you can use an if, but if you have more than 2, it would be good to have a switch. But this, for the switch, you always need to have the outcome of the results, right? So if you want to perform something, if nothing matches, then you still need to use an if, so it goes to the condition else. Now, which business cases could we use to for a switch statement? So we could use an invoice that has 3 typical potential statuses. Like for example, the not started, it's pending, it's approved. Depending on which status it would be, then you would need to perform these different actions. So it's if the invoice is not started, you probably need to create it. If it's pending, you probably need to approve it. And then if it's approved, you probably just need to skip that step and not process the invoice. Then a separate business case would be also as well to process and automatically ordering raw materials for 4 different suppliers. So if the suppliers have different actions depending on the material, then you could use a switch condition. So on the switch condition, you have, for example, you can see it here on this example, you have an expression, but you could also here have only the number, and then depending on the number depending on the variable statuses, then you would have the different cases. Now inside, then you have the case or the actions that you want to perform depending on that case. Okay, so a real example for the if switch condition would be an application which uses regex to extract keywords from the subject of an email. The keyword is evaluated one time, and then something different you need to do depending on the on this, let's say, this extraction, right? So you can see here in this, this is actually an annotation from the activity just to indicate a little bit of what the activity is doing. So if you have here the examples of each invoice, you can see that actually what we want to extract from this text would be this keyword, which would be either created, amendment, cancellation, transfer. So the expression transaction type, this is actually not shown on this example, but before this switch, it will perform here a regex expression just to extract this particular word and not the others. And then in that case, you go to each case and then perform some different actions for depending what the status is of your transaction type. Then we have the conditional control statements, which are loops. So we have while executes a specific sequence while a condition is met. The condition is always evaluated before the execution. So if the condition, for example, is not met, then anything that is within the body will not be executed. That's why it's possible to have 0 executions, because it first checks the score. We have, for example, a robot that is playing blackjack. It calculates the hand before actually deciding whether to draw another card. Then we have the do while, which is similar to the while, but then in this case, the actions will be executed at least once. And this is because the condition is actually just evaluated at the end. So it will only repeat it if that condition then will not be met. So one example would be if in the body of the loop, a robot could perform a refresh command on a website and then check if a relevant element is loaded. So this would be, you would need to refresh, but you exactly don't know how many times you have to do it. So in this case, you inside of the body, you refresh, then you would search for that element that you need to look into the page. And then once that element has been is on the screen, then you know that you can stop the loop. One thing that is very important for either while or do whiles is to sometimes have a counter of repetitions. Let's say, for example, that element that you are trying to search for is never on the screen because the page is down, for example, or never loads, then you would have an infinite loop of just searching for that element when this is something that maybe that condition will never be met. So it will always stay evaluating. Then you have the conditional control statements, the loop for each. This one is particular because it only performs the activities for a particular number of times. And then this is usually for each element of an input collection. So in a for each, you can set it for each item of a list of numbers or a list of names, for example. But you could also be a list of UI elements on the screen, etc. This activity can be changed to load or to execute within any type of argument or any type of data type that a list can contain. So this is actually very useful in data processing. When we have, for example, an array of string, we can check whether, well, the robot can check whether the numeric condition fulfills a certain condition inside, and then you would need it to do it, let's say, for each array. So one example would be if you have a list of invoices which have a particular total, and for the ones that are higher than 1 million, then you would need to perform one step, but then for, let's say, for the ones that are less, then you don't need to. Then this way you can also, let's say, combine loops and conditionals. So what are the ways to execute the loops? Yes. Loops are very fun, but as we mentioned before, they can be a bit risky. So ways to execute a loop, like we mentioned, while or do while. You can exit when checking that the condition is no longer true, or you could, for example, just create a counter of how many times have you created a loop, and then just exit as well if the condition is not met, the thing that you're trying to search for, but also if the maximum retries has also been reached. Then for each loop condition, usually this would just execute until it has processed every item on the list. But let's say if you're trying to search within a list, you're trying to search for something and then stop the processing of that list, then you can also use the break activity to exit the loop at any time. And then there's a different activity, which is the continue. But this actually enables you to skip the remaining steps for a current iteration, but it's not, let's say, exiting the loop. This is just to continue with the next item if you don't want to execute any actions on it. So as an exercise, we will do for each exercise. So I will share my screen in here. I will create then another sequence or another worth of which is a sequence, and then I will put it for each exercise. And in this case, what I want to do is, for example, loop through a list of files that I have in one folder. So in this case, I prepared this folder, which contains a number of invoices. And I will just go through the list and I will do a log message of each one. Then for this, so you have two separate ways of doing it. You have here a snippet for each file in a folder. This is actually quite helpful, but I will show you how to do it from the start. So I will first just create a variable, which would be the input folder or the folder where I'm searching for the files, and I will assign a value to it. So because my folder is actually inside the project folder, I can use a relative path. So I can say here files, or I could use the full path, which in this case would be my project folder or where I have it stored, plus the files folder. Now I can here, for example, just do for each. And I can search for the activity. In this case, if you have the properties, you can see the type of object usually is starting with object, but I want to go through a list of strings. So I will change my type of argument. And then here I will use a VB.NET expression just to get all the files within a folder. So I can just use directory .get files. And if I open here, it will show me as well what are the input arguments that I need to put into the function. So in this case, I just need to indicate the path, which is my variable input folders. And then this would be iterating through the list of files that I have within that folder. What I want to do in this case is just show a log message of what is the full path of those files, or I can also just say the name, let's say. If I go through each item content, this would be the full path of each file. Sorry. And if I use another VB.NET, I could use, for example, path.getFileName from the item, and it will show me the file name. So I can differentiate in the log messages within the files. I will also use here another property from the for each, which is just here the integer, the index, sorry. And I would put another log message for file number. And then I'll just run this file, and then we can check the output, and we will see for file number 1, the full path to this is this, but the name is just the name of the file. Not sure how we are on time. Yeah, very little slides coming. So now we have the second part of the quiz.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Daniela. So we'll quickly move to the next round. Just give a sec. I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, Rohit, it is visible.
Yeah, thank you, Anmol. So here we are. Please request you to go back to menti.com if you, in case anyone has closed it, and use the code 75697523. And we are ready to go to the next question. Yes, we are around 54 people. Just 10 more seconds, just in case anyone else is joining. Yes, perfect. Just go to menti.com and use the code 75697523. Last 5 seconds. So everyone still has a chance to win. We have 2 more questions coming in, and I think we are on. Okay, so I'm going to the next question. So Here we go. Please make sure that you answer fast. What instructions are available in if activity? Then else, true, false, yes, no, why not? Last 10 seconds. Then else, true, false, yes, no, why not? I think everyone has already answered. Let's check the right answer. It is then else. A lot of you have gotten it right. We'll quickly go to the leaderboard and see where we are. This is for this particular question. And where are you? Okay, Simba, you are now leading, but it is very close. Daniel, Harshit, Enrico, Krishna, all of you are very close. Here is the last chance now. Very quickly going to the last question. Please make sure that you enter, you click your answer quickly. And here we go. Which activity cannot be used to perform a series of actions on every item in a collection of data in an array? Do while for each row in a data table. Which activity cannot be used to perform a series of actions on every item in a collection of data in an array? That's it. Oh, that's interesting. We have only 16 of the participants who got it right. Let us see on the leaderboard. Well done, Simba. So here we are. Here we have the winner, Simba. Harshit and Simba, please do DM me your email ID so that we can send you the gift vouchers. The competition has been very close. So congratulations to everyone who have participated. So yeah, that is it from my side. Daniela, anything you want to add before we close the session?
Yes, so
Sure.
what I wanted to share was just the next steps. So for anything that you want to learn and continue on learning on UiPath and just go deeper into the topics that we discussed today, you can log into the UiPath Academy and go to the Learning by Role. All the topics that we discussed are in the RPA Developer Foundation. And specifically, the topics are in the lessons, in the lesson titled Variables, Arguments, and Control Flow in a Studio. And then please join the session number 3, the Introduction to UI Automation. This is where the fun starts, and you can really see processes working and bots working on websites, on any application that you might want to automate. And if you have any questions about the topics that you saw on session 1, session 2, and the following ones, then you can place them in the forum. We have a thread for the summer school, and all of us will be looking into it to answer your questions.
Awesome, thank you. Before we close, I'll just very quickly also share all the links to the upcoming sessions. So please make sure that you all, register for them so that you have it all booked in your calendar. So I have just shared the links. So here we are. This is the link to session number 3. And this is the link to session number 4. So it will be important that everyone registers to each and every session so that it can be blocked in your calendar. And just as Daniela mentioned at the towards the end, this is the link to the forum thread where any of you facing any questions, you don't need to wait till the next session. You can just post it on this forum thread, and we will make sure that all your questions are getting answered. So I think that is it from our side. Anmol, anything you want to add before we close?
I would just like to say thank you guys for such a great audience, and we can all connect over LinkedIn. And if you have any
Yes.
queries, reach out to us.
Yes, please, everyone, please do connect with our speakers, Daniela and Anmol. Not just on these topics, they all keep adding more content on Studio and UiPath, which would be very interesting for anyone who are beginners and who are learning this tool. So please make sure that you are connected to all. Please do also visit community.uipath.com to stay in track of any of the future sessions. Harshit, I received your email ID. It would be good. I think we had one more. Simba was also there, who was a winner. So please do share your mail ID as well, so that we can send you the send you the vouchers for it. Thank you so much. That's it from our side. Looking forward to see you for session number 3. Thank you and have a nice day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you, guys. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye bye.